Anyway, but it's very nice to be back. It's very nice to be back, and it's very nice to see a room full of people. You know, and I feel really warmly welcome here, and it feels like you've got a very good Sangha. Yeah. So the word Sangha means community. It feels like you've got a very good community here. I can see that. I can feel that. So what I'm going to do today with this talk, I'm going to talk about community. I'm going to talk about Sangha, the Sangha Jewel. Yeah. Before I do that, I'm just going to recap a little bit in case you are not around. So we've been following a theme of the three jewels. So I'm going to say something about the three jewels, and then I move on to Sangha, and I move on to the importance of Sangha for ourselves, but also the importance of Sangha for the world. Yeah? So in Buddhism, what the things that we value, the things that we worship and we go for refuge are the three jewels. And the three jewels are the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha. Yeah. So the Buddha, who's sitting here, for us is our highest ideal as human beings, and that's what we follow. Yeah. And I'm gonna say something about it. And then we've got the teaching. You've got the teaching of the Buddha, who's available to us. Yeah. And sometimes we use a symbol as a teaching as a path. Yeah. And it's a path that anybody can take at any point, you know, as much as you like. If you just want to dip in and out, for instance, if you just come to a class today and that's all you want, that's absolutely fine. You can do that. Or you can at some point become a mitra, calling yourself a Buddhist. So you can follow that path. Or you can actually, like myself and other people here, become ordained and become an order member, or monk or nun. Or maybe you can go all the way up to enlightenment. Yeah. So that's the path of the teaching of the Buddha. Yeah. All the way up to enlightenment. Yeah. All the way up to that figure here representing on the shrine. And then we've got the Sangha, the community of practitioners that are practicing the teaching of the Buddha. Yeah. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the experience of the Buddha that he had 2,600 years ago in Bodh Gaya in northern India. And before that, something that I think it's worth to mention is that the Buddha was not a god. The Buddha was not a god. The Buddha was a human being just like us. You could say that he had a very sort of fortunate life. Yeah, he had almost like you could say a privileged life. He had, you know, all the material wealth that he could ever want, anything that he really wanted to. He was really sort of sheltered, and yet he wasn't happy. He wasn't happy. He had a sense of lack of fulfillment, and you could say that he went to some sort of like existential crisis. Yeah, I think in some ways, if we're here, in some ways we can sort of relate with that. And I think all human beings on some level are experiencing some sort of suffering. Yeah, for all, whether you're really fortunate or whether you're not, you will at some point, even if everything is going well in your life, you will at some point experience some sort of suffering in your life. So I'm sure we can all relate to that on some level. Yeah. So he realized that, and what he wanted to do, he wanted to solve the problem of suffering. So one day he decided that he was going to leave everything behind. Yeah, he was going to leave the comfort, the pleasure, the security, everything in order to try to solve the problem of suffering and gain freedom. Yeah, gain freedom from suffering. Yeah. So he went forth. Yeah, he left everything behind, and for about 6 years he tried different traditions, different teachings, different teachers. He had different teachers. Yeah. And he gained progress, but he saw that that wasn't the real deal. Yeah, that wasn't the real deal. And at some point, in Bodh Gaya, northern India, he found a tree, and he, at that point, made the biggest commitment that you can ever make. Yeah, and he said to himself, so you can imagine the Buddha, you know, in northern India, in this place called Bodh Gaya, he finds a tree. So the Buddha is represented here. He finds a tree, and then he really wants to solve the problem of suffering. And he says to himself, I'm gonna sit here, and I'm gonna try to gain freedom or die. Yeah, he was prepared to die. Yeah, he was prepared to die. Exactly what happened at that point, I'm not exactly sure. I don't exactly know, but I think he was being met. There was a response. And at that point, he managed to gain a new type of consciousness, the enlightened consciousness. Yeah, so it's very difficult to explain what it is, but in my own way, what I think he did is that he managed to transcend greed, hatred, and delusion and become a complete embodiment of love, compassion, and wisdom. Yeah, I think that's the best way we can describe his experience right now. Yeah. And it was interesting because he managed to gain his new type of consciousness while doing a version of the mindfulness of breathing that we've done this morning. Yeah. So he was meditating. Yeah, he was doing the Anapanasati, which is another version of the mindfulness of breathing. Yeah. So he's just meditating on the breath. That's how he gained this new type of consciousness. That's how he became this embodiment of love, wisdom, and compassion. Yeah. When he gained that type of consciousness, afterwards, he wanted to teach. He wanted to help people going through the same experience. But he realized that his teaching and his experience was very profound, and he wasn't sure if he could actually do that. He wasn't sure if he could actually share and teach his experience. So he was thinking, who's going to be able to understand? Who's going to be able to understand my experience? Who's going to be able to understand my teaching? Yeah. And he thought about his friends. So before he got enlightened, he had a group of friends who were trying to gain freedom. And in order to do that, they were basically practicing austerities. Yeah, they were basically mortifying the flesh and doing all sorts of sort of like weird practices that people still do in some ways in some places in the world. And because what they believed that in order to gain freedom, all you had to do is to transcend your cravings. Yeah, you just had to do it to transcend your cravings. And what they were doing is because they assumed that one of the biggest craving that we have is, hunger, eating, And so they were starving. They were just starving. They stopped eating completely altogether. And the Buddha was just the best at that. Yeah. So he would starve. He would not eat anything. And one day he realized, he was so skinny, he realized, I'm not actually going to gain freedom. I'm just going to die. Yeah. And at that point, he realized that actually starving was not the way to freedom, but maybe meditation could actually be the way to freedom. And he had a bit of milk, of rice milk, yeah. And his friends saw that, and his friends, they turned against him and they say, "Oh, that's just a loser." The Buddha, at that time, he was called Siddhartha. He's just a loser. He's the guy who drink milk. We don't want to have anything to do with him. Yeah. So the Buddha thinks about his friends, who were called the five ascetics. And he knows that his friends are in Sarnath, a place called Sarnath, close to Varanasi in India. I think it's Uttar Pradesh, I think. Uttar Pradesh, okay, I'm right. Anyway, in Sarnath. And so he walks for a few days. He walks to Sarnath from Bodh Gaya. And then at some point, he meets his friends, the five ascetics. And the five ascetics, to start with, they see the Buddha and they just think, oh, that's our loser friend over there. we don't want to do anything with him. But then he's got such a radiant aura, he's got such a strong presence that they can just connect with him, they just connect with him, yeah. And at that point, they become friends again. And the Buddha tries to teach them. He tries to basically communicate his experience with words and other mediums, yeah. And he's trying to communicate what happened, yeah. And at some point, he realizes that one of his friends, Kondanya, gets it, yeah. And he says, "Oh, Kondanya got it, yeah, true." You can imagine like the Buddha being in Sarnath and just trying to, to explain what happened, in many different ways. And then at some point, Kondanya got it. And Kondanya at that time becomes enlightened, yeah. Through communicating with the Buddha, becomes enlightened, yeah. And at that point, not only we had the Buddha Jewel, but at that point we also had the community, the Sangha Jewel, and also the Dharma Jewel. The teaching was being communicated. Someone has become enlightened. A community was formed, yeah. So the community, you could say, the roots of our Buddhist community started exactly at that point, yeah. And then eventually, the Buddha with his friends, they would go around and they were trying to spread the teaching. They were trying to help people go to that same experience and alleviate suffering, yeah? And then they will meet again, so they will spread in all sorts of direction in India, in the plains and villages and cities, and just teach. And then in the monsoon season, they will come back and they will gather together and they will do their first retreats, yeah? So you've probably been on retreats before, some of you. They will do a retreat, spend time together for 3 months during the rainy season. And then they will come back again to the world, to India, and spread Dharma. And eventually, some people settled from those retreats, those monsoon seasons or some Buddhist gatherings, and then monasteries were built, and then community were built, and then you can trace that all the way to us being here and practicing together as a community. Yeah. So I'm just gonna explain quite quickly the three different levels of community in Buddhism. Yeah. So the first type of community is the Mahasangha, which means the Great Sangha. And this is the Sangha that includes all people who are practicing. So mitras all over the world, all the members, monks, nuns, and other teachers, lamas, and things like that. All the people who are practicing in the world. This is the Mahasangha, the Great Sangha. Yeah. Then you've got the Bhikshu Sangha, which basically consists of all the monks and nuns that are practicing in the world. Yeah. And just as a side note, in our community, in our Triratna community, we've got equal ordination for women and men. And I was reading not long ago that actually the first person who was ordained as an order member in our community, in our Triratna community, was a woman, just as a side note. And then you've got the Arya Sangha. The Arya Sangha basically consists of all the people who've managed to gain this transcendental insight and became a sort of embodiment of enlightenment. Yeah. And then you've got in the Arya Sangha, Arya means noble or holy, the holy Sangha. And you've got some historical figure that actually lived some time ago, yeah, in other places in the world or around here. And that maybe not around here actually, but and part of the Arya Sangha, you've got also the Buddha. So a Buddha is someone who's managed to gain this new type of consciousness, the enlightened consciousness, when there was no one around who's gained that type of consciousness before. There was no teaching, there's no Buddhism whatsoever. He's discovering Buddhism, he's discovering enlightenment, yeah? That's a Buddha. And then you've got a Bodhisattva. A Bodhisattva is someone who either gained enlightenment, who is trying to gain enlightenment, not only for his own sake, but for the sake of all beings, yeah? And sometimes a Bodhisattva, as I said, is enlightened. Sometimes a Bodhisattva might not be enlightened, but is on the way to Buddhahood. So he's entered the stream of enlightenment, yeah? And then you've got the Arahant. The Arahant is the practitioner that managed to gain the fourth level of enlightenment. I'm not going to be able to get into that and get too technical this morning, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of those different types of Sangha. Yeah? 3 types of Sangha: Mahasangha, Bhikshu Sangha, and Arya Sangha. So us today, and in Triratna, as I mentioned, we're part of the Mahasangha, and in Triratna, our Sangha includes people from all over the world. Yeah, so we've got people practicing within our Triratna Buddhist community in America, North America, South America, in India. In India is actually one of the most active Buddhist tradition. And also, you know, other places in the world. I also know that there is like a Buddhist group in Istanbul, and you know, there's a center in France, in Paris, and you know, other places in the world. Yeah. Okay, so why am I actually just opening up? Why do you think community? What do you think community is important? Why Sangha? Why not just having the Buddha and the teaching, the Dharma? Yes, what's your name?
I'm Sarah.
Sarah.
Well, the thought that just kind of popped into my head was, if it's about being an embodiment of love, we need people to love, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely true. Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, great. So, yes.
And to learn from other people's experiences.
To learn from, yeah.
And, yeah, things that they want.
Yeah.
Mistakes they make.
Yeah. Yes. What's your name?
Matt.
Matt. Okay.
I think being around like-minded people allows you to kind of helps you kind of formulate a way of being.
Yeah.
To other people.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Great. So that's great. I'm going to say something about that, but before I say something about that, I'm just going to share with you two stories. The first story is a story of the Buddha and Ananda. Ananda was the cousin of the Buddha, was the best friend of the Buddha. He was also his attendant. And he was really well known for having a very good memory, and he could retain all the words of the Buddha. And I think we owe a lot in the Buddhist tradition to Ananda, because when the Buddha died, because Buddhism was just an oral tradition, the Buddha apparently was illiterate, he couldn't write or read. It's quite taught really when you think about it. But Ananda was able to actually retain all his teachings, and then his teachings eventually were transcribed into what we call the scriptures, Buddhist texts, and then we can learn from those texts. Yeah? Ananda was the best friend of the Buddha, and Ananda one day had an insight, he had a revelation, and he was so excited about that he went to see the Buddha, he went to see his best friend, and he said, Lord, he used to call him Lord, he said, Lord, oh Lord, I had an insight, I had an insight, yeah? And the Buddha was curious about the insight, he said, oh yeah, what it is, and Ananda said, yes, friendship is half of the spiritual life, Lord. Friendship is half of the spiritual life, which is really fair enough to think like that, because we do need friends in order to grow, yeah? And the Buddha said, no, friendship is not half of the spiritual life. Friendship is the whole of the spiritual life. That's quite a big statement. Friendship is the whole of the spiritual life, yeah? The other story is about our teacher, who's here on the shrine, Bhante Sangha. He lived in India for 20 years. And when he was in India, he lived as a monk, and he spent 14 years in a city called Kalimpong in northern India. And at that time, he was very good friend with a teacher called Dardo Rinpoche. Dardo Rinpoche is actually quite here. Dardo Rinpoche was a very revered Tibetan teacher. He was actually a Tulku, had a great Buddhist education, and then became one of the abbot of a monastery of the Tibetan government in Bodh Gaya, and then he moved to Kalimpong, and in Kalimpong he founded the Indo-Tibetan Buddhist Cultural Institute, and he founded a school and an orphanage as well, and he was very instrumental in bringing Buddhism, well, you could say, in India, and be part of the revival of the Buddhism in India, and is a very good friend of Bhante, and they met in Kalimpong. But what was interesting is that they met before. Bhante was not aware of that. And when Dardo Rinpoche was working in Bodh Gaya as an abbot of a monastery for the Tibetan government, he saw Bhante. So Bhante was going, for a pilgrimage, and he went to Bodh Gaya, and he saw Bhante with, shave-headed like a monk with his robes, you could imagine Bhante in his 20s, probably early 20s, maybe 22, 23 years old, going to Bodh Gaya. And he was very pleased by that, Dardo Rinpoche, to see the sight of Bhante, because he's never seen a white monk before. He's never seen a white monk before. And when he saw Bhante, he realized, Buddhism has made it to the West. Yeah, and he's very pleased about that. Anyway, time passed, and then Bhante moved to Kalimpong, where Dardo Rinpoche was living at the time, and then they became really close friends. And Bhante considered Dardo Rinpoche as his teacher and his best friend. Yeah, he was his best friend for all his life. Yeah, even when he was living in England, and they worked together for a long time. In fact, Bhante helped a lot Dardo Rinpoche afterwards, when he managed to create Triratna here, and Karuna, who's just upstairs, and just by the way. But he was asked once. So there was a friend of Bhante who came to visit Dardo Rinpoche, and Bhante used to talk a lot about Dardo Rinpoche and all the things that he's learned from Dardo Rinpoche. Yeah. Once there was a friend of Bhante who came to visit Dardo Rinpoche in India, and he asked him. He said, "What did Bhante teach you? Yeah, we know that you taught a lot to Bhante, but what did Bhante teach you?" And Bhante Sangha. And Dardo Rinpoche said, "Oh, Bhante taught me friendship. Yeah, I learned friendship from being around Bhante." Yeah. So friendship seems to be a big theme in Buddhism, a very important theme. Yeah. So why do we need community? And I'm going to say, why do we need a community of friends, really? The first obvious answer is because I think it's very difficult to practice. I think you're right. If you want to love, we need to love someone else, as it were. Otherwise, we're not loving anything really. But we need, in order to practice, in order to grow, it's very difficult to do it alone. It's very, very difficult to do it alone. Some people try to do it alone. I think that alone, it's very difficult to make progress. You can start the path, and you can even feel that there's some sort of progression, but I think it's really difficult to reach to a level where, you make progress. You can, if you go on YouTube, and you probably all have been on YouTube or reading books, following teachers online and things like that, I think is great. But what you really get is tips. You don't get much more than that. Yeah, and with tips, we don't really get very far. Yeah, in order to grow. In order to basically come closer to that vision of the Buddha, so the whole of Buddhism stems from the Buddha having his experience, his enlightened experience at the Bodhi tree. And I mentioned something about that, but also what happened in that moment is that he managed to transcend the self. So when he reached that new type of consciousness, when Siddhartha Gautama died and he became the Buddha, in a way you could say that he didn't have a sense of self that we have, us. He didn't have a sense of experiencing everything as being out there, like me, I'm sitting here, and I'm experiencing you as being out there, and everything is in here. And everything is sort of dual. It didn't have that dichotomy of like object and subject. He felt that at that time he could connect with all living beings. He had a mind that was completely free of all limitation. And in a way, you could say that it was just connected with all living beings. Because he didn't have that sense of self. You following me? Okay. Now, in order to transcend the self, what we need to do, we can't just transcend the self just like that when we start. It's just not possible. Some people trying to do that. I'm afraid, I think it can actually be quite dangerous and quite confusing and damaging for people. I think where we really need to start in order to do that, we have to refine the self. So before we can see beyond no self or beyond the self, what we really have to do is refine a sense of self. We have, in order to do that, in order to follow that vision, we have to become a healthy, happy human being. And in order to do that, what we need friends. We need to be around people who are willing to be our friends. And what does that mean? That means that we are actually, we do need to be around people that are willing to tell us those things that, to rejoice in us, tell those things that we are that are good to us. But also we have to be around friends that are willing to tell us the truth. And the truth sometimes can be a bit difficult. But if no one does that, it will be very, very difficult for us to refine ourselves. So I think we need to be around people that have the same sort of vision as us, follow the same sort of values, and also have our best interests at heart. And we need to have friends on a horizontal level, so friends that are at the same level as us and are trying to practice the same path, are the same level of us and would be ready to tell us the truth. But also we need people who are more on a vertical level, who are more spiritually advanced than us, and are also represent a certain ideal, and we can look up to them, and in a way we can learn from them. So I was around my teachers for a long time, and I'm still around teachers. I need teachers. I really, really need teachers in my life. And at that time, I was just observing them. I was spying on them. How do they do? How they are? How do they react in certain situations? How they behave? How they can love people, for instance. What does that mean, loving people? Or that we need to learn from people. So in our tradition, and most tradition of Buddhism, what we're trying to do, we're trying to follow that process where we become a more healthy, happy human being, we become more emotionally positive. This is why we do the Metta Bhavana practice. We're trying to be more connected with people. Yeah, we're trying to have good friends who actually are ready to tell us the truth. Yeah, not in a damaging way, but in a good-hearted way, so that we can learn and grow from that. We need to be in a community where people are ready to look at themselves and change themselves, not blaming others, but really look within and being able to feel, oh yeah, I'm sorry I've done that, I apologize for that, instead of blaming other things, and things like that. We need to be in a place where we can feel more integrated as a human being, yeah? That we're not just like being different people, different selves in different situations, but we're just a very consistent, stable human being, yeah? And when we've got that strong solidity, that strong base, when we've got that, yeah, we can eventually transcend the self. We can die spiritually and then reborn spiritually. So for us, for instance, in our tradition, when we practice, we follow that step of positive emotion, becoming more positive, emotionally positive, integration. And when we're really healthy, happy, stable, then we go through ordination. And that's where we die spiritually. This is why we give up our name. I gave up my name 2.5 years ago for a ritual of ordination, and I died spiritually, and I was given a name. Yeah, I was given a new name. Yeah, and I went through a process of spiritual rebirth, and that name and the name that we get in our movement becomes a myth for our lives. It becomes a myth for our lives. So it's aspirational. It's not like I embodied the name, but it becomes the myth of my life. Yeah. So that's what we're trying to do. I think it's very difficult to do that on your own. Like myself, I'm just talking for myself and my own experience. Before coming across Buddhism, I thought I was a nice guy. I thought I was a nice guy. And then I moved into a Buddhist community, and then I realized, oh, you're not so nice as you think you are. I realized actually I had, and I still have, I had lots of aggression, in me, lots of suppressed aggression. I was aware of it, but I thought I was that nice that it was okay. There were definitely things that I need to work with, and that was one of the main things in being aware. Learn how to love people in the best kind of way, without blaming them. They were not the problem. I realized I'm actually the problem. And I'm in a way that was sort of stopping me of being really myself, if you see what I mean. And I was around with people who could hold that. They could really hold that very well. It wasn't always easy. I'm not gonna lie. It wasn't always easy, but it was so rewarding. Communication. I grew up in France. Communication's never been my forte when I was a kid. And then I had to learn a new language, and for a long time I found it difficult to communicate. Not at that level, even on a one-to-one level. But being community, being in a period in a situation which was more intense, and where I learned from people, how do you communicate without hurting people? How do you do that? And I've learned a tremendous amount. I don't think I would have been able to learn if I would have not been around people. So people, in a way, you need friends, we need friends, So for your own level, at your own level, I think for our own growth, for our own flourishment, we need to be around people that are ready to also share the same values, practice the path, and also be a sort of symbol for that path, people that we can look up to and learn from them. I think that's absolutely key, essential. So now the second reason why Sangha is important, I think it's more at sort of global level, at a global level. And why I think when people come together, that can have some very serious positive implication for the world. When we come together and we have a shared vision. When we come together and we have a shared vision, we can create a better world. I think it's really important to not underestimate that. You as a community can have a tremendous positive effect on the world in a way that maybe you cannot even comprehend. I've seen people changing. I've seen people absolutely transform. I was volunteering at the London Buddhist Centre at reception a day a week. I did that for 4 years, and I could see people. If you volunteer at reception, you could do that here. You will know people. You get to know people. I've seen the LBC being a lifeline for people. I've seen people who just on the verge of suicide, and and they just say, look, I just came across the London Buddhist Centre and that saved my life, you know. Buddhism saved their life, you know, whether they carry on with the teaching or not. And that's just a very, very fine example. It's just a very, very fine example, yeah. In our movement, for instance, we trying to help people. Not, I think in Buddhism, sometimes what we're really trying to do is we're trying to solve the problem of the root of suffering. We're really trying to get back to the root. What is the root? The root, the self, yeah? How do you do that? How do you solve suffering by working on the self, yeah? However, it's not because we're trying to help with this, solving the problem of suffering with the root of suffering, that we should not able to also help with direct suffering, yeah? I think it's really important to help direct suffering. And, you know, for instance, I'm just going to give you what I know, but examples that I know. During lockdown, our movement, there were a lot of people in India that were dying from COVID. Dying here as well, but in India, they didn't have the help that we had here. And people live in communities and they didn't have vaccine. I mean, for some of them, it's really horrendous. Yeah, I was aware because I was around, not in India, but I knew the stories and the emails and the conversations. And we managed to collect £500,000 with Triadna. We sent £500,000 as a community to India, and I have no idea how many lives that saves. You know, I don't know. You know, with you know the war in Ukraine, we've also. I'm not going to get into details, but we managed to help people. We managed to find shelters for people. I do know that there's a war going on, another war going on, and I do hope that we can address that in some sort of ways. You know, we can sort of address suffering at its own level as well. Yeah. I'm trying to do my best, and I hope that everybody can sort of do their best, you know, so that you can not only just become a positive influence for yourself when you're working on your, just remember, when you're working on your own and when you do that with others, this will have an effect on your life around you. And it might not have an effect, you know, as much as you like, but it will have an effect on your influences around you. Yeah. Anyway, I just want to finish with a poem that is in my bag. Oh no, that's not my bag. Oh, maybe my bag is outside. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm just gonna get my bag outside and I come back. One sec, sorry. Mindfulness. You see, you can always learn. So I just want to finish by a poem by Rayukan, who used to be a monk, a Zen monk from the 18th century, and he used to be a wanderer, a sort of ascetic, going from places to places, and then he had a little wooden hut in Japan, and he just wrote poetry, and she's got such a lovely heart and lovely words of wisdom. And I just want to read this poem as a tribute to all the teachers, to all my teachers that I've learned from. Yeah. If I find the poem. And I will finish with that. Good friends and excellent teachers, stick close to them. Wealth and power are fleeting dreams, but wise words perfume the world for ages. Thank you.